The auction was not what he came for. Oren Vale had come to Terv's drift for hydraulic seals and a replacement seismic relay, the kind of routine supply run he made every 6 weeks, the kind that took 4 hours and cost him nothing but fuel and the mild social friction of being a solitary human in a settlement that preferred transactions to conversations. He had a list. The list had 7 items. He had expected to leave with 7 items and return to the canyon habitat, with nothing more complicated than the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. The crowd was wrong from the moment he entered the plaza. It had the quality of a crowd gathered for something other than commerce, the specific stillness of people who had arranged themselves around a center of gravity rather than moving through a space with individual purpose. The parts suppliers were open. The seismic relay he needed was visible through the second stall's window, its casing catching the pale light of the drift's twin suns. He could have walked directly to it. He did not walk directly to it. He stopped at the edge of the crowd and looked at the platform. It was a standard auction stage, rust-stained metal, a raised surface designed for visibility rather than dignity, the kind of structure that existed on every outer moon settlement because outer moon settlements had learned early that there was always something someone wanted to sell and always someone willing to pay. He had seen the stage before on previous runs and had noted it the way he noted most things on the drift, as information filed under Not My Concern. The cage door opened. He heard it before he saw it, the clang of iron on iron, a sound with weight in it. And then the crowd shifted slightly, the collective body language of people turning toward something new, and he saw her. She was 12 feet of something the universe had not prepared him for. He understood, intellectually, in the 3 seconds of initial observation, what he was looking at, a Solvari, the species designation flashing through his memory from somewhere in the outer system's xenobiology briefings he had read years ago and retained the way he retained most things, accurately and without particular emotional investment. Violet-skinned. Large. Functionally extinct as of 4 years ago when Xeno Corp's extraction operation on their homeworld had concluded. He had read the press release. It had used the word concluded in the way that words were used when the thing being described was too large to look at directly. None of that was what stopped him. What stopped him was the moment she lifted her head. She had been moving with the heavy, muted grace of someone under chemical sedation, her body present, her mind at distance, the particular quality of enforced absence that restraint drugs produced in large species. Her wrists and ankles were cuffed in iron that looked inadequate even from 30 feet away. Her hair was platinum and matted. Her suit was torn at the shoulder, at the knee, the fabric dark with something that had dried. She lifted her head, her eyes found his. They were dark, large, and completely awake. Not the eyes of someone the sedative had reached. The eyes of someone who had decided that the sedative could have her body and nothing else, who had drawn a line at some interior point and was holding it with everything she had left. He saw the decision in her eyes, the specific quality of a person who has been reduced to one remaining sovereignty and is protecting it with absolute precision. He saw the defiance. He saw beneath the defiance the exhaustion of maintaining it. He saw beneath the exhaustion something he did not have a word for. He would spend a long time later trying to find the word. The closest he came was remainder, the thing that was left of a person after everything else had been taken, the irreducible core, the part that the universe had not found a mechanism to remove. The auctioneer's voice cut through the plaza. A Cathari, serpentine, 4 arms moving with the practiced fluency of someone who had done this many times and found it uncomplicated. The words arrived in the amplified register of professional commerce. Prime specimen, 400 kilograms, grade C meat, guaranteed sterile. The word barren appeared on a holographic display beside her in red, as though it were a relevant specification, as though it were a fact rather than a lie constructed to make a transaction possible. Oren looked at the display. He looked at her. Her eyes had moved away. She was looking at nothing, the trained unfocus of someone who had learned that looking at the crowd only provided information she could not act on. But in the moment before she looked away, in the fraction of a second while her gaze was still in his vicinity, something had passed between them that he could not have described if asked, and did not try to. He pulled out his data pad. He was not thinking clearly. He was aware of this with the same detached precision with which he was aware of most things. He noted the clarity impairment the way he noted equipment faults, as a variable to account for rather than a reason to stop. His hands were steady. His face was the face he maintained in all public spaces on the drift, which was no face in particular, a surface of mild neutral attention that communicated nothing and invited nothing. His hands were steady, and his face was neutral, and he was dismantling his life with his thumbs. The claim on Sector Gamma 7 went first. 4 years of survey work, 18 months of active extraction rights, the thorium deposit that was 3 months from beginning to yield at a rate that would have cleared his ship mortgage in 2 years. Sold. The data confirmed the transfer in the flat, uninflected language of financial systems that did not have opinions about what they processed. He bid 15,000. The Gorgon mercenary captain. He had noticed the captain in his peripheral vision, four-eyed, stone-heighted, the kind of large that was different from Vasra's large, the kind of large that existed to reduce things rather than tend them, turned to look at him. Orin did not return the look. He bid 25 against the captain's 20. He liquidated his iridium futures. He bid 35 against 50 and accessed his retirement account, the one he had been building since he was 23, the account that was supposed to be the quiet old age at the end of the long solitary accumulation, the account that had taken 12 years to reach a number he was about to spend in a single afternoon on a remote moon in an outer system where no one he knew would ever hear about it. He bid 100,000. The plaza went quiet in the specific way of a space where many people have simultaneously arrived at the same thought, and none of them have said it yet. The Gorgon captain stared at him. The assessment in those 4 eyes was cold and professional, calculating whether the number was madness or strategy, and arriving correctly at the conclusion that it didn't matter. The price had left the territory of commerce. The captain was a professional. He had no interest in principle. He shook his head. The Cathari auctioneer's voice arrived with the contained delight of a system that had just produced an anomalous result. Sold. Orin's data pad confirmed the transfer. His balance read a number that was technically positive and practically nothing. His hands were still steady. He walked toward the stage, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds parted for things they did not understand and were not certain were safe. The drive to the habitat took 2 hours. He had chosen the habitat's location for its isolation, which had always been a preference rather than a necessity. He was a man who did his best thinking alone, and who found the presence of the settlement's ambient social complexity tiring in the way that background noise was tiring, not painful but cumulative. Today he was grateful for the 2 hours of empty canyon road in a way that went beyond preference. She sat on the speeder's cargo bed. He had not asked her to sit there. She had looked at the vehicle, assessed it, and chosen the configuration that made structural sense given her dimensions, the cargo bed's open space versus the cab's enclosed inadequacy. She made the decision without consulting him, which he noted and found correct. Her knees were drawn up, her bound hands resting on them, her eyes on the canyon walls as they moved through the fractured rock landscape of the drift's interior. She did not speak. She did not look at him. He drove. The canyon was the color of dried blood in the afternoon light, the stone oxidized to a deep rust that the twin suns made briefly vivid before the shadows took it back. He had driven this road 140 times. He knew this because he counted things, had always counted things, the numerical texture of his days a kind of anchor, and had never found it particularly remarkable. Today it looked different. He was not sure if the canyon had changed or if he had. He stopped the speeder in front of the habitat dome. It was a standard prospector's unit, low, gray, functional, the viewport looking out over the kilometer-deep chasm of the great crevasse that ran along the canyon's eastern edge. He had added modifications over 4 years of occupancy. Better insulation, a larger atmospheric processor, a geological sensor array on the roof that gave him a 3-kilometer survey radius. It was his. It had been his. He was standing at the end of the sentence that contained the word his, and he was not certain what came after the period. He looked from the airlock door to her. The door was standard human prospector dimensions. "You'll have to stoop," he said, the first words he had said to her since the plaza. She looked at the door. She looked at him. She said nothing. She slid off the cargo bed and her feet touched the reddish dust without sound, 12 feet of significant mass landing with a quietness that suggested considerable deliberate control, that suggested she was capable of making much more noise and was choosing not to. She followed him to the door and bent nearly in half to pass through it, and inside she straightened, and her head brushed the curved ceiling by perhaps 2 inches. He went to his tool locker. He moved slowly and he moved with his hands visible, which was not something he thought about consciously but which his body had decided was appropriate without consulting him. He took out the industrial plasma cutter, the heavy-grade model, the one designed for shearing through compressed rock strata, and he turned around. She was watching him. Her body had changed configuration. The defensive posture, the hands rising slightly, the specific readiness of someone who has been harmed enough times with tools to have developed a reflexive geometry of self-protection. Her eyes were on the cutter. He held up his free hand, palm open. He pointed to the cutter, he pointed to her wrists, he said the shackles. She looked at the cutter. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face with a thorough, unhurried assessment of someone reading something that mattered and wanting to read it correctly. He kept his face the same face he kept in public, no performance of reassurance, no exaggeration of gentleness, just what was there, which was a tired man who had spent everything he had and wanted the first thing he did in the new configuration of his life to be the correct thing. She lowered her hands. She extended her left wrist. He worked with the focus the task deserved. The cutter hissed, the metal glowed, the shackle parted. The sound of it hitting the floor had a weight to it that was not proportional to its physical mass. He moved to the right wrist, then the ankles. Each time a piece of iron hit the floor, she seemed to recalibrate, not dramatically, not visibly in any theatrical way, but in the manner of a structure that had been compressed and was redistributing itself now that the compression was removed. When the last shackle fell, she straightened to her full height. He went to his medical kit. He came back with antiseptic and dermal salve, and he gestured to her wrists, to the raw and abraded skin beneath where the iron had been. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something that he was not prepared for. She knelt. Kneeling, her head was still level with his chest. She offered her hands. He cleaned the wounds carefully and dressed them and did not speak while he did it, because the moment had a quality to it that speech would have damaged, a fragile and specific quality that he had no name for but recognized as something to protect. When he was finished, he filled his largest water container, a 5-liter canister, the emergency reserve, and set it on the floor in front of her along with 3 nutrient packs. Then he went to his workstation and sat down and turned his back. He heard the seal break on the water. He heard the long sound of someone drinking. He looked at his workstation screen, and the screen showed him his account balance, and the account balance showed him the sum total of what remained of 12 years, and he sat with that for a while, and then he began trying to figure out what to do next, which was the only thing available to do. Behind him, the sound of drinking continued for a long time. He decided this was sufficient for today. He decided this was, in fact, everything. The habitat was small. He had never thought of it as small before because it had always been the right size, sized for one person, calibrated to one person's requirements, organized around the needs and habits of a single human who preferred order and silence, and the particular satisfaction of a space that contained exactly what was necessary and nothing more. He had lived in it for 4 years and had found it comfortable. It was not sized for her. This was not a complaint. It was a logistical fact that required a logistical response, and Oren Vale had spent 12 years solving logistical problems in isolated locations with limited resources, which was perhaps the only relevant qualification he possessed for the current situation. He began solving it the morning after the auction with the methodical attention he gave to all problems, starting with what was most urgent and working outward. The atmospheric processor required recalibration. Her species had a different respiratory baseline, higher oxygen tolerance, different CO2 threshold, and the processor's standard human settings were producing an environment that was functional but not optimal. He recalibrated it while she stood at the viewport, her back to him, watching the crevasse. She did not acknowledge the change when it completed, but he noticed that her shoulders changed, a fractional release, the imperceptible easing of a body that had been compensating for mild discomfort and had just stopped needing to. He noted this. The sleeping arrangement required addressing. His cot was in the back room and was not relevant to her dimensions. She had claimed the main room's floor on the first night without discussion, arranging the spare insulation blankets he had set out into a configuration that made sense for her proportions, her body curled in the way of something large that had learned to minimize its footprint. He did not comment on this. He reconfigured the blanket supply, added the thermal underlayer from his emergency kit, and placed the larger of his 2 portable heaters within her radius. In the morning, the heater had been moved 6 inches further away. He left it where she moved it. The nutrient synthesizer needed adjustment. He tripled its output rate and reconfigured the macronutrient ratios for her mass, which required a manual override and 2 hours of recalibration work. He did not tell her he was doing this. He simply did it, and the food that appeared thereafter was more of it, different in composition, appropriate in a way the previous output had not been. She ate without comment. He observed that she ate everything produced and adjusted the rate again. She did not speak. He had expected this. He had not expected to find it not comfortable exactly, but workable. He was a man who had spent 12 years in the primary company of his own thoughts, who had developed an extensive relationship with silence and understood its varieties. Her silence was a specific variety, not the silence of absence, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had decided that speech was a resource to be conserved until the conditions for its use were correct. He recognized the logic even if he did not know the conditions. He did not attempt conversation. He worked. He sat at his workstation and ran geological analyses on survey data he had already analyzed, because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was not in his nature. And the analyses at least gave his hands and a portion of his mind something to occupy while the rest of his mind processed the thing he had done, and what it meant, and what came next, none of which had resolved itself yet into anything he could act on. She watched him. He felt her attention the way he felt changes in atmospheric pressure, not with a specific sensory organ, but with the accumulated sensitivity of someone who had lived alone long enough to notice deviations from baseline with precision. She was not hostile. She was not warm. She was observing him the way he imagined she had observed everything in her captivity, thoroughly, without expression, cataloging data without yet deciding what to do with it. On the second day, he reorganized the tool locker. This was not necessary. He did it anyway, because the tool locker was in the main room, and reorganizing it gave him a reason to be present in the space she occupied without the awkwardness of being present for no purpose. He worked through the inventory with the same systematic attention he gave everything, and at some point he became aware that she had turned from the viewport and was watching his hands. He continued working. She watched his hands move through the tools, the cutter that had freed her, the sensor calibrators, the geological instruments, the small, precise implements of a trade that was about finding value in unpromising places. He did not perform for her observation. He worked as he always worked, and she watched, and something in the quality of the room changed in a way he could not have quantified but was real. On the third day, she touched one of the geological instruments. She had crossed to the tool locker while he was running diagnostics at the workstation. He heard her movement, the particular quality of her footstep that the habitat's floor transmitted differently than a human's, and kept his eyes on his screen. He heard her pick something up. He heard her examine it, the small sounds of careful handling, the attention of someone who was accustomed to understanding objects through direct contact rather than description. He did not turn around. After a while, he heard her set it back down. He noted this also. On the fourth day, he saw the bioport. He had noticed the mark on her shoulder on the first day and had logged it as a possible injury requiring attention, something beneath the torn fabric, geometric in the way of technology rather than organic in the way of scarring. He had not examined it. The list of things he had not done and was not doing was, he understood, the operative architecture of whatever this was between them, a structure built of restraints as much as actions, of what was withheld as much as what was offered. On the fourth day, the angle of the morning light came through the viewport differently, and she had shifted her position at some point in the night, and the tear in her suit had opened further, and he saw it properly. Not a scar, not a brand, something precise and internal, subcutaneous lines branching from a central node with the specific geometry of engineered technology that had been designed to be seamless, and had nearly succeeded. He sat for a moment with what he was seeing. Then he picked up his data pad and walked to her with the deliberate, unhurried pace he had been using for 4 days, the pace that communicated, "I am not moving quickly because nothing I do here requires urgency," and he held up the pad. He pointed to her shoulder. He pointed to the diagnostic port on the device. He held her gaze. The risk was significant, and he tried to show this in his expression without overstating it. The direct neural interface that her bioport would require was a connection designed for data transfer between compatible systems, and the compatibility was technical rather than experiential, meaning his prospector's implant could access the port but had not been built to survive what might be on the other side of it. He had seen neural interface accidents. He had read the medical reports. He was offering to take a risk whose outcome included permanent cognitive damage. And he was offering it because the alternative was continuing to exist in the same room as someone he had spent his life savings on without understanding anything about her, except that she had been standing on an auction block and had kept her eyes awake. He showed her the interface cable. She looked at it for a long time. She turned. She exposed her shoulder. She presented the port to him with the same gesture she had used when she offered her wrists for the shackle removal. A deliberate, complete, unhedged presentation. The gesture of someone who had decided and was executing the decision without the performance of uncertainty. He connected the cable. He took a breath. He connected the other end to the jack at the base of his skull. The world dissolved. It was not data. He had interfaced with mining equipment for 12 years. He understood data transfer as a technical phenomenon, as information moving between systems in formats that his implant translated into usable output, coordinates, density readings, spectral analysis, the cold numerical language of rock and ore and depth. He had expected something of that register, something he could observe from a professional distance. This was not that. The first thing he felt was soil. Not the dry, oxidized dust of Terv's drift, not the mineral-dense substrate of any moon he had worked. Living soil, dense and dark and complex, layered with the biological activity of something that had been alive and accumulating for a very long time. He felt it under feet that were not his feet, through a body whose scale made the sensation enormous, the contact between self and earth spanning a surface area that made the word ground feel inadequate. He looked up through her memory and saw her sky. It was green. Not the sickly green of atmospheric processing errors, but a genuine deep living green, the sky of a world whose atmosphere was saturated with the exhalation of planetary-scale flora, a biosphere so productive that its own output tinted the light. He saw the trees, not trees as he understood them, but structures of biological complexity that dwarfed everything in his experience, canopies that began at heights that would have been mountaintops on terrestrial worlds, root systems that he understood, through her memory, were not individual organisms, but a continuous network, a single planetary organism with 10,000 visible expressions. He felt her name, not as a sound, as a concept, a self-image, the way a person experienced their own identity from the inside, not Vasra the word, but Vasra the fact of existing, the specific texture of being this person in this body on this world, the deep somatic knowledge of belonging to a place the way her people belonged, not as inhabitants, but as components, their biological scale a function of their ecological role. Their great bodies the result of generations of symbiosis with a planetary system that had made them larger because larger was what it needed. Then the sky turned orange. He had read the Xenocorp press release. He had read the word concluded. He understood intellectually what had happened to the Solvari homeworld. He had understood it the way he understood most facts about the galaxy's political and corporate history, with the detached accuracy of someone who processes information without being required to feel it. He felt it now. The neural interface had no mechanism for detachment. He experienced her memory in the register in which she had lived it, the plasma weapons as sound and heat, and the smell of burning biology, the mechanized units as a ground vibration that her symbiotic sensitivity translated as the death of root networks, the scream of a planetary organism being severed. He experienced the cage from the inside, the sedative needle from the inside, the auction block from the inside, through eyes that had kept themselves awake, through an act of will that he now understood had required more than he had words for. He experienced the lie, the classification, barren, breeding defect, biological dead end, arrived in her memory not as an abstract administrative designation, but as the specific moment she heard it spoken about her for the first time, the moment she understood what they had decided she was so they could decide what to do with her, the deliberate construction of a false fact in service of a transaction. He felt what that moment had cost her. He felt the interior reconfiguration it had required, the decision to survive it, the decision to maintain something inviolable in the face of it, the decision that was visible from the outside as the spark he had seen from 30 feet away in a dusty plaza. The feedback loop overloaded. He felt his implant burn, a precise, local pain, the specific sensation of a component exceeding its operational parameters, And then the sensation stopped because the system processing it had stopped. And the world went to a place that was not black because black was still a color, and this was the absence of the category. He woke to coolness on his forehead. Consciousness arrived in stages. First the sensation of the cool cloth, then the smell of the medical salve he had used on her wrists, then the quality of the light, which was different from the light of unconsciousness, and then the hand. Her hand. He opened his eyes. She was kneeling over him, her focus entirely on his face. The expression she wore not the blank observational neutrality of the last 4 days, but something present and specific. Concern, he realized, the specific tight-jawed attentiveness of someone monitoring a condition, and not liking what they were monitoring. She was holding the cloth with the same careful precision he had used on her wrists, the same economy of touch, the same understanding that the point was function rather than performance. He was the patient, she was the caretaker. He attempted to sit up. His body lodged a formal objection. A sound escaped him. A hum came from her. Low, resonant, a frequency he felt through the floor. He understood it. He understood it with the residue of the connection still in him, the bridge of psychic resonance that the interface had left behind even as the data transfer itself had burned out his implant. The hum meant, do not move yet. He sank back down. He lay on the floor of his habitat and looked at the ceiling and held what he had experienced the way you held something hot, carefully, with the understanding that the holding itself was temporary and the thing you were holding was not going to stop being what it was no matter how long you held it. Her world, her people, the planetary organism, the living canopy, the green sky, all of it concluded. All of it in the Xenocorp archives under a press release that had used 6 sentences, and the word concluded. He looked at her. He saw her clearly now in the way that the connection had made possible, not the categories he had applied on the first day, Silvari, large, violet, survivor, but the person who had survived, who had drawn the line at some interior point and held it, who had stood on the auction block and kept her eyes awake while everything else was taken. He moistened his lips. His voice arrived rough and lower than usual. Vasra, he said. The effect was immediate and total. Her hand went still. Her entire body went rigid in the way of someone who has received a signal they had stopped believing would ever come. He had said her name, not the alien, not you, not any of the 1,000 evasions available. He had said her name in his alien voice, with the weight of someone who knew what the name meant because he had felt it from the inside. Her eyes filled. He had not been certain until that moment whether the tears were something her biology did. They were. They moved down her face in the same way tears moved on every face he had ever seen and carried the same weight, the weight of something that had been held a very long time being released, and there was nothing small about it, and he did not look away. I saw, he said, all of it. She lowered her head. He reached out. His hand found her arm, his hand small against the violet of her skin, pale and work-worn and entirely inadequate to the scale of what it was trying to touch. He held her arm and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that would not be less than what the moment required. They remained that way for a long time. When she lifted her head, something had changed in her eyes. The grief still present, not gone, would never be gone, but alongside it something else, something that had been sealed and was now open. She looked at him for a long moment with the full attention she had been withholding for 4 days. Then she spoke. Her voice was a resonance. A cello left out in a warm room. It filled the habitat not through volume but through quality, through the specific frequency of a voice that had been designed by biology for a world with different acoustics, a voice built for open canopies and root network communication. Even the single syllable she produced, a sound of inquiry, of opening, of the question that preceded all other questions, transformed the air in the small dome into something different. You know, she said. I saw, he said again. I know what was taken. I know what the lie was for. She was quiet for a moment. The tears had stopped. She was looking at him with the assessment she had been applying for 4 days, and he understood now that the assessment had always been about this, whether he was a person who could be trusted with the weight of what she carried, whether the silence had found the right conditions to end. My world, she said. Yes. My people. Yes. Gone. The word arrived flat and final, and she said it the way a person stated a fact that they had already survived, and were standing now not to process it, but to establish whether the person they were speaking to could hold it without flinching. He held it. Almost, he said. She looked at him. The data logs I've seen, Xenocorp tracking operations, survivors. He kept his voice level informational because this was the kind of information that required a steady container, not gone, almost. She was very still. Almost, she said, and the word in her voice had a different quality than it had in his, something that was not hope exactly. Because hope was a fragile thing, and what was in her voice was not fragile. It was a decision, a forward-facing thing, the same quality he had seen in her eyes on the auction block. Tell me, she said. He told her. They talked until the twin suns set over the canyon rim, her voice filling the dome with its resonant warmth, his answering in the quieter register of a man who had spent 12 years perfecting the habit of saying only what was accurate. They exchanged histories with the careful economy of people who understood that language was a resource, and that the resources available to them were about to become significantly more limited. He did not tell her what he had spent to buy her, because the number was not the point, and he was not certain he had earned the right to use it. He told her about the drift, about the work, about 12 years of solitary accumulation that had ended on a Tuesday afternoon in a plaza while he was supposed to be buying seismic relays. She told him about Silva, about the root networks, about the planetary canopy and the green sky, and the way her people had understood themselves as participants in a system larger than any individual organism, their great scale a gift from a world that had needed gardeners of sufficient size to tend it. She told him about the cage. He listened to all of it. He did not look away from any of it. He filed it in the place where he filed things that mattered, which was different from the place where he filed operational data, deeper, less accessible, the place that only opened when something had earned the right to be there. The twin suns set, the canyon went dark. The proximity alarm triggered. The alarm had a specific sound, not the general alert tone of the habitat's environmental systems, not the subtle chime of the geological sensors identifying subsurface activity, but the hard, insistent pulse of the perimeter monitor, the one he had installed in the first year on the drift when he understood that isolation was protection only until someone decided the isolation was convenient for them rather than for him. He had not heard it in 4 years. He was at the control panel in 3 steps. The tactical display resolved into a single red icon moving along the canyon's western approach, ground vehicle, heavy class, the sensor signature consistent with military-grade shielding, the kind of shielding that cost more than most outer moon settlements spent on their entire defensive infrastructure. It was moving at a deliberate pace, not the pace of someone who had found something by accident, the pace of someone who had known where to look and had taken the time to prepare before looking. It's him, Oren said. He did not need to explain who. She was already standing, her posture reconfigured in the 2 seconds between the alarm's first pulse and now. The softness of the evening's conversation gone, replaced by something entirely different, a focused stillness that he recognized from the auction block, the quality of a person who had been waiting for this and was not surprised by its arrival. The Gorgon, she said, not a question. One vehicle, heavy shielded. He was pulling the tactical feed to full resolution, reading the approach vector. He's coming up the west path. He'll be in sensor range of the habitat in approximately 4 minutes. He pulled his pulse rifle from the wall rack. The weapon felt wrong in his hands in the way it always felt wrong. He was accurate with it, had qualified at the colony range every year as required, but accuracy and comfort were different things, and he had never been comfortable with it. He thinks I'm still alone. He's testing the defenses before committing. How many in the vehicle? Can't resolve occupants through the shielding. At least the driver, possibly 2 or 3. She was looking at the tactical display with the attention of someone reading something in a language they knew well. Her eyes moved across the terrain mapping, the approach vectors, the habitat structural diagram that occupied the display's right quadrant. He watched her read it and understood that she was not reading it as a person encountering unfamiliar technology, but as a person who understood space and approach and the geometry of threat as thoroughly as he understood geological strata. He will aim for the primary entry, she said. It is the obvious point. It is what I would aim for. The kinetic shield will absorb 1 direct hit, maybe 2 if he doesn't use the cannon at full yield. He will use full yield, she said. He is angry. Angry men use full yield. She was already moving. He watched her cross the habitat to the far wall where the equipment storage units were mounted, heavy containers, core sample collections, the dense geological archive of 4 years of survey work, each unit massing several hundred kilograms. She braced her feet. She put her shoulder against the largest unit and pushed. The unit moved. It moved with the sound of dense weight crossing floor plating under controlled force, a grinding that he felt through his boots, and she guided it across the floor toward the airlock with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much force the task required and was applying exactly that amount. The unit hit the airlock frame and seated itself against the door with a finality that was entirely structural, solid metal, and compressed rock against the entry point, a barricade that would take more than plasma fire to move. He looked at what she had done. He looked at her. "Smart," he said. She did not respond to the word. She was already back at the tactical display, watching the red icons approach. "When he fires," she said, "you use your emitter, the geological thumper. The sonic pulse will disable the vehicle's electronics. It will also disable mine for approximately 40 seconds. I know," she looked at him. "Time the pulse for after the first shot. He will expect the barricade to fail. The pause will confuse him. The sonic wave takes the vehicle. Then they are on foot. A pause. On foot, they are manageable." "There are at least 3 of them," Oren said. "Yes," she said, in the tone of someone for whom this arithmetic presented no particular difficulty. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about saying several things. He said none of them because the tactical display was showing him 30 seconds to firing range, and the time for saying things had passed. He went to the emitter controls. The habitat went quiet in the specific way of a space preparing for impact. The atmospheric processor's hum seemed louder in the silence. The control panel's indicators seemed brighter. His own breathing seemed to occupy more acoustic space than it had before. He watched the red icon on the display. He watched it stop at the position he had identified as optimal firing range. The cannon fired. The sound arrived as a physical force, not the sharp crack of conventional weaponry, but the concussive thump of a plasma discharge at significant yield, the kind of sound that the body registered as impact before the ears registered as noise. The kinetic shield flared across every display simultaneously, a cascade of warning indicators in yellow and red, the shield's capacitors straining against the absorption load. The habitat shook. Something on the workstation fell. The lights dropped to emergency levels and recovered. The barricade held the door. "Now," she said. He slammed the emitter activation. The sonic pulse was not audible in the way of conventional sound. It was below the range of human hearing, a subsonic wave that the body experienced as pressure, as a sudden tightening of the inner ear, as a vibration in the sternum that lasted 3 seconds and left behind a ringing that was not quite hearing and not quite silence. On the external display, the feed cutting in and out as the pulse affected his own systems, he saw the Gorgon's vehicle seize. The shielding collapsed. The vehicle's drive systems arrested. The canopy hissed open. 3 figures emerged. The Gorgon captain first, enormous, stone-hided, moving with the specific anger of a professional whose equipment had just failed him. 2 mercenaries behind him, shaking their heads, recalibrating. Armed, coming toward the habitat at a run. "My turn," Vasra said. She was at the viewport. He had time to say Vasra, and then she kicked the armored glass. Not the kick of someone testing a surface, the kick of someone who had calculated the frame's structural tolerance, identified the failure point, and applied sufficient force to reach it in a single application. The armorglass panel tore free. She went through the opening with the fluid-controlled motion of something large moving at its full capacity without apology. He watched the external feed. She crossed the distance to the mercenaries in a span of time that recalibrated his understanding of what she was capable of. He had known, intellectually, what her scale implied about her physical capacity. He understood now that intellectual knowledge and witnessed reality were not the same category of information. She moved like whether purposeful, total, the trajectory of something that did not negotiate with obstacles but simply accounted for them. The mercenaries fired. The plasma bolts hit her and left marks, scorched places on her suit, abraded patches on her skin, and did not stop her. He watched this with the focused attention of someone taking in information he would need later, storing it in the accurate, non-emotional way he stored geological data. Her biology was not invulnerable. She was absorbing damage and processing it and continuing, which was different from being unhurt. She reached the first mercenary. She disarmed him in a single motion that left him functional and without weapons, which he recognized as a choice. She was making choices about what she applied her force to. She was not destroying. She was removing capacity. She worked through the three of them with an efficiency that was difficult to watch and impossible to look away from, and when she was finished, they were all three on the ground, breathing, their weapons in pieces around them. The Gorgon captain stared at her. He had the look of a professional encountering a variable his models had not contained, the four-eyed stare of a man recalculating in real time. He looked at his crew on the ground. He looked at her. He made the professional assessment that professionals made when the numbers stopped working in their favor. He spat in the dust. He turned and walked back to his disabled vehicle. Oren released a breath he had been holding since the cannon fired. They dragged the disabled vehicle and its occupants to a side canyon 300 meters from the habitat. The mercenaries were conscious by the time they finished, groggy, aching, their pride the most significant casualty. Oren stripped their communications equipment and their weapons with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that incomplete jobs became future problems. Vasra watched him work without comment. When he finished, the Gorgon's crew had transport back to the settlement, and no means of reporting their location until they reached it. "He will come back," Oren said. "Yes." "With more?" Yes, she was looking at the canyon walls, at the habitat dome visible at the canyon's edge with its blown-out viewport and its scored shield plating. "This place is finished." He looked at the habitat. 4 years of modifications. The atmospheric processor recalibrated for her biology. The geological sensor array on the roof. The viewport that looked out over the crevasse at a view he had found over the years to be the closest thing to adequate compensation for everything else about the drift that was difficult. He had built this place into something that worked, something that was his, in the specific and hard-won way that things became yours after years of steady investment. "Yes," he said, "it's finished." They went back inside and began the work of salvage. The work took the rest of that day and through the night. They moved through the habitat with the coordination of people who had learned each other's spatial habits over the previous days. He knew how she moved through the small space, where she needed clearance, which surfaces she used, which she avoided. She knew his working patterns, the sequence of tasks he ran when he was solving a problem, the particular stillness that meant he was thinking versus the particular stillness that meant he was doing something that required no active thought. The repairs were triage rather than restoration. The viewport frame patched with structural foam and the spare metal sheeting from the equipment storage. The shield generator assessed, its damaged capacitors bypassed in favor of a reduced-yield configuration that was better than nothing and worse than adequate. The atmospheric processor secured, its modified settings locked to the configuration he had built for her. He worked through the mercenary communications equipment between structural tasks, bypassing the military encryption with the patient lateral approach he used on geological survey locks, finding not the intended path through, but the path the designers had not thought to close. The encryption fell at 300. The data inside was not what he expected. He sat with it for a long time before he spoke. "Vasra." She was at the viewport, the patched viewport, the structural foam still curring at its edges, looking out at the crevasse in the dark. She turned. "Come look at this." She crossed the room and bent to see the screen. He watched her read it. He watched her read the shipping manifests first, then the stellar coordinates, then the communications logs, the chain of corporate correspondence that described, in the flat administrative language of an organization that had decided what something was, and was therefore no longer required to consider what it actually was, the network of operations tracking Sylvari survivors across the outer systems. Processing plants, holding facilities, transport schedules. Coordinates tagged with Sylvari biosignature readings. Living people, tagged and scheduled and coordinates assigned. She read it without expression. He had learned over the previous days that her expressionlessness was not absence but containment, the specific quality of a person processing something at a depth that required the surface to be still in order for the depth to function. He waited. "How many?" she said finally. "The data is 3 months old. The numbers are not small." "How many?" He told her. She was still for a long time after that. He did not interrupt the stillness. He had learned that her stillness was working and that interrupting working was waste, and he did not waste things. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not louder, not harder. Different in the way that a compass changed when it found north, the variability gone, the direction fixed, the wobble of uncertainty resolved into a single orientation. "I want to find them," she said. He looked at her. "The coordinates, the transports." She gestured at the screen. "I want to go." "It is a Xeno-Corp operation," he said. "Sector-wide, multiple facilities. We have a prospector's ship with a mortgage on it and a pulse rifle and the element of surprise, which we will have exactly once before they know we are doing this." "Yes," she said. He looked at the data on the screen. He looked at the coordinates, the transport schedules, the clinical rows of captured people being moved between facilities like cargo because the paperwork said they were cargo. He looked at what remained of his habitat, the patched viewport, the scored walls, the equipment stripped to salvage weight. He thought about what came after the period at the end of the sentence that had contained the word his. "The ship," he said. "Yes. It is not configured for your dimensions. Reconfigure it. That will take. How long?" He calculated. 2 days. Maybe 3 if the bulkhead removal hits the secondary conduit array, which it probably will. 3 days, she said. Not a question. A parameter accepted and incorporated. He looked at her for a long moment. This was the moment. He understood this clearly in the way he understood geological inflection points, the layer where one stratum ended and something different began. He had spent everything he had on an impulse he still could not fully explain. He had spent 4 days not knowing if that impulse had been rescue or something else, if the transaction had been one thing or another, if the word his that had attached itself to the habitat could also attach itself to a person, without becoming the wrong kind of word entirely. She was not asking him. She was telling him what she intended to do and leaving space for him to exist in whatever relationship to that intention he chose. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. 3 days, he said. Probably 2.5 if the conduit cooperates. She held his gaze for a moment with the thorough, unhurried attention she gave to things that mattered. "Thank you," she said, not the way a person thanked someone for a gift, the way a person acknowledged a fact. He turned back to the data screen and began mapping the first set of coordinates against the transport schedules, identifying the window with the greatest probability of minimum corporate response, beginning the work of planning something that was going to be extremely dangerous with the same methodical patience he had applied to every difficult problem his career had produced. Behind him, he heard her begin to move through the habitat, separating what was worth taking from what was not, her hands finding the relevant and releasing the rest, her judgments fast and accurate in the way of someone who had already lost everything once and understood with precision what mattered. The twin suns rose over the canyon rim. The habitat, 4 years of his life, the modifications and the recalibrations and the viewport that looked out over the crevasse, stood in the morning light with the specific quality of a thing that had served its purpose and was now available to become something else. He looked at it once. He noted it. He filed it in the place where he filed things that were finished. He began to plan. The venture sat in the habitat's landing cradle under a tarpaulin he had maintained out of habit rather than necessity. The moon's dust was corrosive to exterior plating over time, and the habit had survived the 3 months between visits when he had considered selling the ship and decided against it for reasons he had not examined closely at the time and was now grateful for. He pulled the tarpaulin off and looked at her. She was a prospector's vessel, compact, functional, designed for one human and the equipment of one human's work, with the modifications he had made over 4 years of ownership that had improved her without transforming her. The cargo hold was the largest interior space, designed for ore samples and heavy survey equipment. It was not designed for 12 feet of Silvari. The reconfiguration required was significant, and he approached it the way he approached all significant problems, by beginning. She worked alongside him. He had not asked her to. She had simply arrived at the ship on the morning of the first day with the implicit understanding of someone who recognized productive work and intended to contribute to it. He had handed her tools without ceremony and explained what needed removing, and she had removed it with a precision that suggested either natural aptitude or some previous experience with structural work that he did not ask about. The bulkhead removal hit the secondary conduit array, as he had predicted. He spent 4 hours rerouting the conduit configuration around the new geometry. Working in the confined space of the cargo holds wall cavity with the focused irritation of a man doing a fiddly task in inadequate light. She passed tools through the access panel when he asked for them and did not speak, but he was aware of her presence outside the cavity in the way he was aware of most things she did, as information that occupied a specific place in his attention without demanding anything of it. On the second day, the structural modifications were complete, and he reconfigured the life support distribution for the expanded cargo space, adjusting the atmospheric nodes to cover the new layout. He had modified the ship's life support before, twice, for different reasons, and the work was familiar enough that part of his mind was free while he did it. He thought about what she had said when she told him what she wanted to do. She had not said we. She had said, "I want to find them." She had said, "I want to go." She had left the door open and he had walked through it, and he was clear that walking through it had been his choice rather than her invitation. He thought about this for a long time in the way he thought about load-bearing structures, testing the architecture for weaknesses, for the places where what looked solid might not hold. He had spent 100,000 credits on her. He had spent them on an impulse he still could not fully name, not heroism, not calculation, not the transactional logic of investment. He had spent them because of the spark in her eyes and what the spark had meant, what it had said about the person maintaining it, what it had said about what was being done to that person in that plaza on that afternoon. He had not spent them to own her. He was certain of this. He was certain of it, and he was also honest enough to understand that certainty about one's own intentions was not the same as correctness, and that the only evidence available for what his intentions actually were was what he did next. He kept working. On the morning of the third day, she found him in the cargo hold, checking the new configuration's weight distribution. She stood at the hold's entrance and looked at the space, the reconfigured interior, the dimensions adjusted for her, the structural modifications that had consumed 3 days and what remained of his portable equipment. She looked at what he had built. "It is enough," she said. He looked up from the weight distribution check. "The ceiling clearance is 2 inches less than I wanted. There's a conduit junction at the aft end that—" "It is enough," she said again. He stopped. She was looking at the space with the expression he had seen on the third day of their coexistence, when she had touched his geological instrument and set it back down, the careful, weighted attention of someone who was calibrating the significance of a thing. She looked at the hold, and then she looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not gratitude in the way gratitude was usually offered, not the performance of appreciation, not the acknowledgement of debt, but something more specific, the recognition of an act for what it actually was. He had reconfigured his ship for her. He had not done it because she had asked. He had not done it because he expected something in return. He had done it because she was going somewhere, and she needed to be able to go in a way that was adequate to her, and he was the person who could make that possible, and the making possible was the point. She understood this. He could see that she understood it. "We leave at first dark," he said. "Yes." He went back to the weight distribution check. She went back to the work of loading what they were taking. Her movements through the cargo hold now different from her movements through the habitat, more space, better clearance, her full height available to her without the constant accommodation the dome had required. He noted the difference in how she moved and filed it in the place where he filed things that mattered. The twin suns crossed the sky. At dusk, he walked through the habitat one last time. Not from sentiment, from the prospector's habit of the terminal inventory, the check that nothing useful had been left, and nothing dangerous had been left unsecured. He walked through the rooms that he had recalibrated and adjusted, and that had worked for 4 years, and then for 4 additional days in a different configuration, and he found nothing that needed to be taken and nothing that needed to be secured. He stood in the main room where she had pressed her wrists toward him on the first evening. He stood at the viewport, patched, functional, the structural foam cured to a gray that didn't quite match the original frame, and looked at the crevasse one final time. The twin suns were below the canyon rim. The crevasse was dark. He had looked at this view 141 times. He turned his back on it. He walked out. The habitat sat in the canyon as he lifted the venture from the landing cradle, its dome pale in the rising moonlight, its viewport looking out at the crevasse with nobody left to look through it. He watched it until the canyon's curve took it from view. He set the first coordinate. The venture lifted from Terv's drift on a trajectory he had calculated with the same patient precision he had given to 4 years of geological survey work, and the moon fell away beneath them, and ahead the stars were the stars of the outer system, cold and numerous and indifferent, the same stars he had navigated for 12 years on the premise of a future that no longer existed. He navigated them now on a different premise. In the cargo hold, he heard her settle into the reconfigured space, the specific sounds of a body finding its position, of weight distributed correctly, of someone who had enough room. He heard a single long exhalation, the sound of someone who had been in inadequate space for a very long time inhabiting adequate space for the first time. He flew. The first target was a transport vessel called the Cedral Mast. Orin had identified it from the recovered data logs as the most accessible intercept in the current window, a mid-weight Xenocorp cargo carrier running a standard outer system route. Its manifest listing 23 units of Grade C biological material scheduled for transfer to a processing facility in the Kepler remnant. The Cedral Mast was not a military vessel. It was a logistics vessel, crewed by people who moved things from one place to another and did not ask what the things were, which was a specific category of complicity he had spent 3 days of transit thinking about and had not finished thinking about. The intercept point was a jump gate transition, the 30-second window when a vessel's navigation systems were occupied with the gate calculation, and its crew's attention was on the transition rather than on what was around them. He had found this window in the data logs, in the transit scheduling records that DOS's communications had contained, and he had spent the transit to the gate running the intercept calculation until the numbers stopped changing. The plan was straightforward. The plan's straightforwardness was its primary virtue and its primary risk, because straightforward plans left no room for the variables that emerged from the gap between the controlled environment of a workstation calculation and the uncontrolled environment of actual events. "I will take the bridge," Vasra said. They were in the Venture's cockpit, the jump gate visible on the forward display, a ring of infrastructure that had always seemed to Orin to be the galaxy's most honest admission that the distances involved were not actually navigable without significant external assistance. The Cedral Mast was 6 minutes from transition. "The crew is 7, Orin said. Bridge will have 2. Cargo management will have 1, maybe 2. He pulled up the vessel's schematics, standard mid-weight layout, the cargo hold amidships, the bridge forward, the crew quarters aft. "I take cargo management. Get to the hold, get the doors open." "The crew," she said. Contained, not harmed, he looked at her. "The crew are employees, they move things, they don't make decisions about what the things are." She was quiet for a moment. "Some of them know." Probably he kept his voice even. "Knowing and deciding are different. We are not here for the crew." She held his gaze with the assessment she brought to everything he said, not accepting, not refusing, reading it for accuracy. He had learned that she did not agree with things because agreement was socially convenient. She agreed with things because they were correct, and she withheld agreement from things that weren't, and the distinction was absolute. "All right," she said. He docked the Venture to the Cedral Mast's secondary port during the transition window, the magnetic coupling engaging with the particular clunk of metal finding metal in the zero friction of open space, a sound he had heard hundreds of times docking at survey stations, and that now had a completely different weight. He cycled the airlock. He checked his pulse rifle. He looked at Vasra. She had armed herself with the weapons stripped from DOS's crew on the drift, a mercenary-grade plasma repeater that looked appropriately scaled in her hands and would have been a two-handed weapon for anyone else in the vicinity. She had not asked his opinion about bringing it. He had not offered one. 3 minutes before they noticed the docking clamp, he said. She moved into the Cedral Mast's corridor, and he followed, and they separated at the first junction. She forward toward the bridge, and he toward the cargo management station amidships. He moved through the ship's corridor with the deliberate, unhurried pace that he had found, in the drift's confined spaces over 12 years, attracted less attention than anything that read as urgency. The Cedral Mast was lit for standard operations, functional white lighting, the ambient sounds of a working vessel, the distant vibration of drives still cycling down from the transition. He found the cargo management station empty. This was a variable his calculation had not contained. He stood in the empty station and looked at the monitoring consoles, the hold access controls, the manifest display showing 23 entries under the Grade C biological material designation. The station should have had one operator, possibly two. He checked the adjacent corridor. He checked the secondary monitoring room. He found nobody. His comm clicked. Vasra's voice low, bridges secured, 2 crew, unharmed. Cargo management is empty, he said. I'm going to the hold. A pause, I will come. Stay with the bridge crew. Keep them from the communications panel. He was already moving toward the hold access. I can manage the hold. Orient. 2 minutes, he said. The access code should be in the manifest system. The manifest system yielded the code with less resistance than he expected. Xenocorp's internal security was designed to keep external parties out, not to complicate operations for its own employees, and the access logic reflected this. The hold door opened. The smell arrived before the light adjusted. He stood in the hold entrance and waited for his eyes to accommodate and breathed through the smell and kept his face the face he kept, the face that processed information without performance, because performance would not help anything and he needed to see clearly. There were 23 of them. Not uniformly, not the neat catalogued units of the manifest. 23 people, Silvari, all of them ranging from what appeared to be advanced age to what appeared to be early adolescence, in a hold configured for their containment, the way the auction block had been configured for Vasra's display. With the logic of livestock management, space calculated for minimum adequate survival rather than for any quality of the thing surviving. They were cuffed, as she had been. They were sedated, as she had been, some of them more deeply than others, the youngest ones in a chemical state so complete that they had not reacted to the hold door opening. He stood there for 3 seconds. He filed what he was seeing in the place where he filed things that were real and required action, and he crossed the hold to the nearest occupied restraint position and began removing the cuffs with the plasma cutter he had brought for precisely this purpose, working with the focused precision of a man who understood that the feelings available to him about what he was seeing were not the most useful thing he could apply to the situation. He had removed 4 sets of cuffs when he heard the footstep behind him. Not Vasra's footstep. The floor registered hers differently, the mass distribution distinctive enough that he had learned it on the venture and would not confuse it with anything else. This was a human footstep, light, careful, the footstep of someone who had been in the room already and had been waiting to see what he would do. He turned. The cargo manager was young, mid-20s, human, with the look of someone who had taken a logistics job on an outer system route, because outer system routes paid relocation bonuses, and the salary looked reasonable before you understood what the cargo was. She was standing between 2 of the occupied restraint positions with a hand calm raised, and her eyes on Oren with the specific expression of someone who had been running a calculation for the last 90 seconds and had not yet reached a conclusion. You are not Xenocorp security, she said. No. You are not a competitor operation. She was reading him. He let her read. You are removing the restraints. Yes. Her eyes moved to the nearest Silvari, an elderly male, sedated to near immobility, his violet skin showing the abraded marks of long restraint at the wrists. She looked at this for a moment. There is a second hold, she said. He went still. The manifest shows 23. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a voice that has been performing one register and has decided to stop. The operational manifest shows 31. The second hold is in the aft section. Maintenance corridor B, 3rd junction. He looked at her. I have been on this route for 4 months, she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the elderly Silvari. I know what the cargo is. I have known for 4 months. A pause that contained several things. I am telling you about the second hold. He held what she had said, and what she had not said, and what the 4 months implied, and he filed it without resolution in the place where he filed complicated things, because resolution was not what the moment required. Stay here, he said. Do not touch the communications panel. I know, she said. He calmed Vasra. There is a second hold. 31 total, not 23. I need you in the main hold now. There are minors here. They are deeply sedated. They will need to be carried. A pause that he used to locate the right words and found he did not have them. There are children, Vasra. The silence on the comm lasted 2 seconds. I am coming, she said. The transfer took 40 minutes. He had planned for 20. The additional 8 Silvari in the second hold included 3 who were sedated beyond ambulatory function and required carrying, and the Venture's reconfigured cargo hold, built for one large person with reasonable comfort, was now required to hold 31 people in conditions that were better than the Cedral mast's hold and worse than anything he was comfortable with, and the only option available. He worked without stopping. Vasra worked beside him, or rather, she worked and he worked alongside her, because the ratio of contribution was not equivalent, her capacity to move the non-ambulatory Silvari safely and quickly being several times his own. He watched her handle the deeply sedated children with a care that was precise and total, her massive hands managing the small bodies with the specific delicacy of something powerful that understood what delicacy required. He watched her face while she worked. She was not performing. She was not managing an expression for his benefit or for theirs. She was entirely occupied with the work, with each person in front of her, with the specific task of moving a specific body from one inadequate space to a less inadequate one. But beneath the occupation, in the quality of her breathing, in the way her hands paused for 1/2 second on each person before moving them, he saw something that the evening in the habitat had not shown him, something that the conversation about Silva and the root networks had not fully communicated. She was recognizing them. Not individually, she had been in isolation since before most of them would have been captured, and the sedation erased whatever surface recognition their faces might have offered. She was recognizing them as her people, as the category of person that the green sky and the root networks and the living canopy had produced, as the remainder of something she had believed was gone. He watched her hold this recognition and work through it and not stop working, and he understood that this was what the inviolable core looked like in action. Not defiance exactly, not the spark from the auction block, but the thing the spark had been protecting, the capacity to continue to function in the presence of things that would have stopped a person who had not learned to contain them. He kept working. When the last person was transferred, and the hold sealed and the Venture decoupled from the Cedral mast, he sat in the pilot's seat and ran the departure calculation and began the sequence that would take them away from the jump gate and toward the coordinates he had identified 3 days ago as a potential safe harbor, an abandoned terraforming installation on a small moon in the outer Kepler system, off the standard transit charts, unlisted in the Xenocorp operational database. He flew. In the cargo hold, he heard Vasra's voice, low, resonant, a frequency that carried through the Venture's hull plating in the same way her hum had carried through the habitat floor. He could not hear the words. He could hear the quality of the sound, which was the same quality as the hum she had produced when he tried to sit up after the neural interface, the quality of something being communicated that language was insufficient for, of meaning carried by frequency rather than syntax. He listened to it for a long time while he flew. He made the mistake on the third rescue. He had been awake for 31 hours, which was not unprecedented, but was the wrong condition in which to make decisions that had not been discussed. The third target was a holding facility rather than a transit vessel, a fixed installation, more complex, the kind of operation that required more variables managed simultaneously, and therefore rewarded the kind of rapid individual decision-making that he had been relying on increasingly as the missions accumulated. The facility had a secondary alert system that the recovered data logs had not noted. He found it when the primary breach was already underway. A redundant communication relay buried in the installation's structural foundation, independent of the main system, designed to transmit an automated distress signal to Xenocorp's nearest response hub if the primary system was taken offline. He found it with 11 Silvari already in the process of being moved toward the Venture, and Vasra managing the movement from the facility's interior and a 12-minute window before the redundant relay completed its transmission cycle. He made a decision. He rerouted the facility's power distribution to cut the relay. It was a clean solution. The relay required a specific power draw that he could interrupt without affecting the life support or the lighting or any of the systems that were currently occupied by 31 people in transit. He executed it in 4 minutes. The relay went dark. The transmission did not complete. He did not tell Vasra he had done it. Not from deception, from the operational logic of the moment, the understanding that the 4 minutes had been time-critical, and that explanation was not the most efficient use of 4 time-critical minutes. He executed the solution and returned to the evacuation flow and said nothing, and the mission completed, and they were back on the venture with 11 additional people, and a facility behind them that Xenocorp would eventually realize had gone dark but would not know why. He told her on the return transit. He told her in the way he told her most things, directly, without embellishment, the facts in the sequence they had occurred. He told her about the redundant relay, about the 4-minute window, about the rerouting solution. He told her it had worked. She listened. When he finished, the quality of her silence was different from the silences he had learned. "You did not tell me," she said. "There wasn't time to." "You did not tell me," she said again. The repetition was not for emphasis. It was a correction, a recalibration, the specific tone of someone identifying the actual content of what had been said and nomming it accurately. He stopped. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the full attention she brought to things that required it, not anger, not the hot quality of offense, but something more precise and therefore more difficult to sit with. She was looking at him the way she had read him in the plaza, the way she had read him on every subsequent occasion when something mattered, the thorough, patient, unsentimental assessment of a person deciding what something was. "I made a call," he said. "The window was 4 minutes. I solved the problem." "Yes," she said. "You solved the problem, your assessment of the problem, your solution." A pause that was not a pause for breath, but a pause that was itself a statement. 31 people were in that facility because someone decided what their problem was without asking them. He did not answer immediately. He held what she had said and turned it over with the care he gave to load-bearing structures, testing it for accuracy, finding the accuracy all the way down. "I know," he said. "I am not cargo," she said. "They are not cargo. This is not your operation. I am not something you are managing." The words were not loud. They did not need to be loud. They were the words that named the thing he had been most afraid of nomming since the plaza, not afraid because he disagreed, but afraid because he knew the difference between believing a thing and consistently acting in accordance with it. And he had just demonstrated the gap between those two things in a 4-minute window on a third rescue mission. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. "I know what I did," he said. "I know why I did it, which was efficiency, which is not a sufficient reason." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to explain it further than that because the explanation is not the point." She was still looking at him. He went to the navigation console. He pulled up the ship's control interface, the full panel, every system, the navigation and the life support and the weapons management and the communications array and the hold controls. He transferred the command authorization to a secondary profile, the profile he had built on the transit from the drift and had not used, the profile sized for her handprint rather than his. He turned and held the console access key toward her. She looked at it. "The ship," he said, "all of it. No conditions, no caveats." He kept his voice even. "I am on this mission because I chose to be and because I have skills that are useful. I am not in charge of this mission. I was never in charge of this mission. I was wrong to act as though I was." The cargo hold was quiet behind them. 31 people in a reconfigured space that was better than the alternative, breathing recycled air, alive. She looked at the key for a long moment. She took it. She did not go to the navigation console immediately. She stood with the key in her hand and looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not the relief of someone who had been given something back, but the specific quality of someone who was recalibrating the architecture of what they had believed about a situation. Not forgiving him, that was not the right word for what was happening. Adjusting for accuracy. Updating the model. "I need you," she said finally, "your knowledge of their systems. You're a pause searching for the word, your precision. The way you find the path they did not close." "I know," he said. "That is not the same as you deciding." "I know," he said again. She went to the navigation console. She studied it for several minutes in silence, her hands moving over the interface with the deliberate care of someone learning a new instrument, finding the logic of it, mapping it against the logic of what she already understood. He watched and did not help unless asked, which she was not. She said the next course. He watched the coordinate she chose resolve on the forward display, the fourth target from the data logs, a transit vessel with a different approach vector than the ones he had been favoring, a bolder line, a tighter window. A route that used the outer system's debris field as cover in a way his own planning had considered and set aside as high risk, and that she had looked at and seen differently. He ran the calculation. The risk was real. The window was tight. The debris field navigation required a precision he was confident he could manage, and that the plan he had been running would not have required. The debris field approach, he said. Yes, I can fly it. I know, she said. That is why I chose it. He looked at the course, he looked at her. Okay, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, the assessment, the reading, the thorough, unhurried attention. Whatever she found, she kept to herself. She sat down in the navigator's seat. He sat in the pilot's seat. The Venture moved through the outer dark on the course she had set, and he flew it with the precision the debris field required, and she watched the sensor display and called the adjustments in the low, resonant voice that had become, over the weeks of transit, the voice he calibrated his attention to above every other sound the ship produced. They did not discuss what had happened again. There was nothing further to discuss. The event was accurate, the correction was accurate, and the work ahead was what it was. The silence that followed was not the original silence, not the armored, withholding silence of the first 4 days in the habitat. It was a different silence, the silence of two people who had reached a place that had cost something to reach and were now operating from it. He flew the debris field in 19 minutes. The window required 22. She did not comment on the 3 minutes. He did not offer them as evidence of anything. They were simply what the task had produced, which was sufficient. The abandoned terraforming installation was on a moon that had been assessed as marginally viable 40 years ago and deprioritized when more productive targets became available, which meant it had the partial infrastructure of a project interrupted mid-execution. Atmospheric processors running at low capacity, producing breathable air at the margins of comfortable, and structural foundations that had been completed before the funding was redirected, solid and empty, waiting for the buildings that had never been built above them. He found it functional, she found it something more. He watched her walk the foundations on the first morning after their arrival with the first group of rescued Sylvari, the 31 from the Cedral mast, and the second hold, now alert, sedatives metabolized, moving through the thin air of the installation's atmospheric envelope with the cautious, deliberate attention of people who had learned not to trust new environments and were testing this one carefully. She walked with them, not ahead, not directing among them, her pace matching theirs, her presence making the space different. He watched from the Venture's loading ramp and did not intrude. They talked to her, quietly at first, then less quietly. He could not hear the words. Her people's language at a distance was a resonance that his ears registered as meaning without providing content. But he could hear the quality of the exchange, the specific frequency of people who had been in silence for a very long time, rediscovering that there were others who spoke the same language. One of the elders touched the foundation concrete and held his hand flat against it for a long time. Vasra crouched beside him, still enormous in the crouch, still the largest thing in the landscape, and placed her own hand on the concrete beside his and said something. The elder looked at the sky. It was not green. It was the pale gray-violet of a marginal atmosphere, honest about its limitations, nothing like the canopy world that the neural interface had shown him. It was not Silva. It would never be Silva. The elder kept looking at it anyway, with the specific attention of someone finding something in what was actually there rather than what was absent. Orin went back to work. The installation had been abandoned with its equipment in place, which was the outer system's version of infrastructure, things left because moving them cost more than leaving them. He assessed what was present with the systematic thoroughness of 12 years of resource evaluation and found more than he had expected. Atmospheric processors that were aged but functional structural materials sufficient for basic habitation. A water reclamation system that needed work but was not beyond repair. He began the repairs. He did not ask permission, and he did not announce what he was doing. He simply identified the most urgent task and began it, which was the water reclamation system, because water was the first requirement of everything else, and the system's failure points were mechanical rather than systemic, the kind of problems that responded to the patient lateral approach he applied to all problems, finding not the path the designers intended, but the path still available. On the second day, Vasra came and stood beside him while he was working. He did not look up. He continued working. The foundations are good, she said. Yes, whoever planned this installation knew what they were doing. The structural work is solid. We can build here. He looked up then. She was looking at the site, the foundations, the atmospheric envelope's edge visible in the thin line of shimmer at the installation's perimeter, the pale sky above it. She was looking at it with the reading attention, the thorough assessment. How long, she said, before Xenocorp identifies this location? The moon is off the standard charts. The installation predates their current operational database by 15 years. He ran the estimate he had been running since they arrived. If we maintain communication silence and avoid the standard transit lanes, months possibly. If we're careless, less. Then we have time, she said. Enough to begin. He looked at the foundations. He thought about what begin meant, not the rescue operations, which were ongoing and would continue for as long as the data logs had targets and the venture had fuel. Something else. Something that required foundations in the literal sense and in the other sense. I can build, he said. I know materials, structural loads, atmospheric requirements. He paused. I don't know what your people need, what the buildings should be, what a Solvari settlement looks like when it's built for Solvari rather than for Xenocorp's containment logic. She was quiet for a moment. We do not build with metal, she said. We cultivate. Our structures grow. But she looked at the foundation concrete, at the installation's existing infrastructure. We are not on Silva. The flora here is not what we need. We begin with what is here and we change it as we are able. That is how all settlements begin, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said, it is. He went back to the water reclamation system, and she went back to the Solvari, and the afternoon passed in the thin, pale light of a moon that was not anyone's home yet.